because the first question we have tonight, right, is why did we use object.x here? And don't follow along with me yet. We'll get set up in another day folder in a minute. But I just want to dive into this question because I think it's a really good one, right? So if we just console log out our movies, right? And we that's out of here. Go live on this. When we take a look at our console, refresh that and take out some of these other console logs so we can. Okay. So we have this array, right? And we're looking at it right here. I'm sorry, this object. Totally misspoke there. This is an object, not an array. And so when we look at this, we have key value pairs, right? So if we wanted to loop over this and say, hey, I want to loop over each one of the values in the object. Well, what happens is if we write a for loop right here that says for const movie of movies, console log movie, what do you expect to happen to come out of that for loop? Do you expect to get the keys of all of the movies? Do you expect to get the values of all the movies? Do you expect to get that as an entire object? Right? Like when we loop over an array, it's really easy to go, well, this is a list, and so give me each item in this list. But when we loop over an object, if we try and do this, you'll see that we get an error that movies is not iterable, because basically in JavaScript, it's like, I don't know what you want me to loop over in the object. Do you want me to give you all of the keys in the object? Do you want me to give you all the values in the object? Do you want both? Well, we can actually do that. What we do is there are 3 helper functions we can use to basically turn an object into an array. And then once it is an array, we can loop over that. So if we wanted to get all of the keys from the movie, we could say object.keys, and you'll see that comes out. Well, now, because we are just getting the keys from that object, we could use that down here and say object.keys. That is going to give us the titles. Then we can log each one of the titles and get all of that information out. We can also do that with the values if we wanted to. We can say, hey, console log over all the values and then loop over the values. That's going to give us the data about the movie. And now we see that come out as well. So object.values and object.keys are converting our object based off of what method we're using into an array. And once it's an array, we can loop over all of that data inside of it. Okay,
Really quick.
well, yeah.
Are data and title reserved, or are those, did you set a variable there?
No, so that is a variable name that I made up there. You can literally call that whatever you want, but you want to always be descriptive on your variable names.
I see what happened there. Okay. I didn't realize it was gonna loop.
Yes, yeah, it's in a loop, and because of that, we can access it in the scope of that loop. Okay, well, if we, let me pause there. Do we have any questions on values or keys, or why we use object.keys or object.values?
Yeah, why we can't do like movie dot like Citizen King dot like price. It
You can,
like am I
right?
like confusing myself with that, or is it like
We could say movies Citizen Kane dot price, and that gets 9 out. That was not our objective, though. Our objective was not generate seats for each individual movie. Our objective was create a loop that runs over all of the movies in the object. So when did we use object.entries? We used it when we wanted to loop over each one of the objects in the movie's object, the big parent object. The goal was to say, go over each individual movie inside of that object. Well, we can't write a for loop over an object itself. So what we do is we use this object.entries, which is kind of a combination of both object.keys and object.values, to convert that into an array. And now that it's an array, we're able to loop over all of that data. So if we wanted to, we could write out a line of code. Instead of putting this in a for loop, we could have written this out that said, hey, options plus equals option value movies Citizen Kane dot well, we couldn't even access the title, right? We would have to hard code the titles in there. So the reason that we use object.entries here was to basically convert our object into an array so that we could loop over it. And so if we look at just the one final example here, what we did is, right, when we saw, hey, if we used object.keys and say movies in there, we get all of the keys out. And now we're like, well, that's just an array. We can write a for loop of that says for const title of object.keys movies. And that's going to give us The Godfather. And then the next time the loop runs, it's going to give us Citizen Kane. And then the next time the loop runs, it's going to give us Planet of the Apes, right? An array is like, oh, okay, that's just a list. We know how to loop over that. But again, if we just did that for loop over the movies itself, it's like, what do you want me to loop over? What do you want me to return? Do you want the key? Do you want the value? What do you want? And so what we did is we used object.entries, which is kind of a combination. So what it does is it returns an array, and we're like, okay, well, we know how to loop over an array, right? That's not a problem. And then inside that array, there's another array. And so what we do is we use this concept called destructuring here to basically break that array up, take whatever is in the first part of the array, store it in movie title, and then take whatever the second part of the array is, which happens to be the value of the object, and store it in a thing called movie data. And then we can use that down here, both for the movie title and for the movie data dot price. And at any point, if we're like, how's that working? I don't quite understand it. We can always console.log movie title and movie data and see all of that information come out. That helpful? So
Yeah,
that is the level of understanding I want you guys to be shooting for, right? Of like, object.entries is not just something I'm going to type because Max typed it and my code's working. We want to shoot for that level of like, but why did we need object.entries? What is object.entries doing? How would we do that in the future? If you're at that point where you're like, okay, object.entries, you know what? I don't think Max explained that, right? That's a great question to ask. Why do we need object.entries, and what does object.entries do? Object.entries is a conversion utility built into JavaScript that converts our objects into key value pairs that we can access in an array. Why do we need object.entries? Because we need to loop over our object, and in JavaScript, and in most other languages, loops only work over iterable items. What is an iterable item? Something like an array is iterable, but an object itself is not iterable. We can't loop over an object directly. So instead, we use object.entries to break apart the key value pairs into an array so that we can loop over it. That was a great start to the questions from last night. Were there other questions that popped up? Remember, your homework was to review 1 through 10. Oh, sorry, I'm just pulling up the chat now. I missed things in there. The homework for last night was review 1 through 10 and just come up with any questions of we need to review this, or I don't quite understand this, or why did we do it this way, or I read your comment and still don't understand that line of code, anything along those lines. I haven't started a live share yet just because we've got to set up the next day. So as soon as I get through all the questions, I will do a live share on the day 2 folder instead of the day 1 folder from yesterday. And yes, thank you, Asma, for putting those comments in there. And Joe, yes, you were partially right. Partial credit.
And the three key details.
Other questions from yesterday's code, only through the 1 through 10 that we happen to comment.
Why do we did let options instead of cons options on 6?
Good question. For 6, because we are going to change options down the road, right? So if we wanted to say, hey, option is going to always and only equal an opening option tag and a closing option tag, we could do a const on that. But instead, we're modifying options down here, right? We continue to add to it. So if we did a const here, you will see we get an error assignment to a constant variable. Well, that problem is not on 39 where we declare it. That problem is actually down here on 64 because we can declare any variable that we want as constant, but if we try to change a constant variable, we're going to get that error right here, assignment to a constant variable. What does that mean? We're trying to update the assignment, the value, basically, to a variable that we said, hey, you're not allowed to change this variable. So because of that, we use a let up here. And that's also why in our for loop down here, we use let for these column and row iterators. Why? Because we add 1 to them every time the loop runs. And so because of that, we need to make that variable be allowed to be changed. Other questions? Yes, go through push one more time. So push is a really simple JavaScript method. So if we make, again, don't follow me on this. These are all just examples. We'll get started on commenting out the rest of the code and get that set up in a new folder in a second. So I'm going to say let.
You're not sharing your screen.
Thank you. Let animals equal an empty array. And if we have our animals, what we can do is push a new item to the end of it, like dog. Then we can console log our animals and see that dog is in there. There are a ton of different array methods. Another one, so we can push as many items as we want here. We can push a cat to the list.
Sort?
There is a sort. There is a animals.pop. And the cool thing about VS Code is that if you kind of just type the method name in, it will say removes the last element from the array and returns it. If the array is empty, undefined is returned, and the array is not modified. So pop is going to remove my cat from the list because it takes it out from the last item. There is shift and unshift, which I never remember off the top of my head. I would say 95% of the time when you're working with an array, you're going to be using push because arrays, you just want to add an item onto the end of it. However, dot filter and dot sort are two newer ES6 methods that do make it much easier to filter and sort through an array. You can also do a dot map over an array, which is another way of looping over it. There's a dot for each as well, which is an alternative to our for of loop. There are all kinds of array methods. And if you just do a search for JS array methods, you will get a long list. Oh, dot includes is one that is really helpful that you use a lot, right? Does this array include a dog in it, right? You see. So you can see there's a whole list in here of dot find, dot push, which we were just in, right? And if you click into it, you'll see the definition of it. So you don't need to get too far into all of these methods, but over time, as you're reading through code, you'll be like, dot push, I don't know what dot push is doing. Let me figure out what the type of that variable is that we are pushing onto. Oh, that's an array. Now let me go Google JS array push and figure out what the parameters are, what it's doing, what it returns, all of that stuff. I will say there are certain methods like dot push I use all the time. There are other ones that I have to look up every single time, right? And that's okay. You're always allowed to use documentation on the job. You'll never be limited to be like, oh no, that you've got to have all this memorized. And out of all of these, there may be, I don't know, 5 of them on the list that I could use without documentation. There may be 2 of them on the list that I expect you to use without documentation. So that's just something that builds up over time, but also don't think that you need to have it like fully memorized at any point. Tiffany had a good question. Can you compare object.entries versus map? So map is only used on arrays. Object.entries is used to convert an object into an array that we can then work with. So if we wanted to, let's say we have our dog and our cat in our array, right? And we wanted a new array that said, I think I think dogs are cool. I think cats are cool, right? Well, what we could do is say, const new array is equal to animals dot map. And map is like a for loop over the array that returns whatever the value of the callback is. So what we can do is get each individual animal here and then return a template literal that says, I think animal are cool. So map is used more to not only loop over an array, but to return a new array with different values based off of what you're looping over, right? So in here, we can get our new array out. And if we look, I think dogs are cool. I think cats are cool, right? So that's just a way to say original array, let's map over it to transform each individual value. Whatever gets returned from this function is what will be the value for that particular index, and then have it all there. That is different from our object.entries, which is saying, like, we could say, make Toyota model Camry. And then if we console log out the object.entries of my obj, we're going to see that we get an array, right? And that array is going to have a nested arrays inside of it, one which is the key make, and then the other which is the model Toyota. So that just makes it a little bit easier to go, oh, let me loop over each key value pair, each entry in this object, and then I can get access to each individual one of those in the array. If you're kind of struggling with this syntax up here, where we break it out into the movie title and movie data, the other way that you can write this for loop is saying for const entry of object dot entries my obj, and then const key is equal to entry bracket 0 and const value is equal to entry bracket 1. Because these are just arrays, right? We can break those key value pairs out based off of their indexes. So because of that, we can actually log out the key value here and get out make Toyota model Camry based off of those arrays that are coming from the entry. So what we did is called array destructuring or object destructuring. In this case, it's an array where we basically do this step all in one by saying key value right here. And that accomplishes the exact same thing. Is that helpful? Does that answer the question?
So the thing to remember is when we're using object entries, we're using it to convert an object into an array so we can loop it, because you can't do a for loop on the object.
Correct.
Okay. Yeah. Let me write this down.
Joe, the question is, does animals.map, is that synonymous with a for each const animal of animals? Well, your example isn't a for each, it's a for of, because a for each is something a little different. A for each and a dot map are actually much more similar. The difference is when you map over something, the function, whatever the function returns, is what gets saved into the new array, compared to for each, which is not necessarily made to generate a new array out. But what we did up here, right, which was looping over all of the key value pairs in the object, once we used object.entries, we could have done that with .map, we could have done that with for each, we could have done that with a for of, right? Once it's an array, there are probably 10 different ways of looping over an array. It just becomes a matter of, well, which are you trying to do, right? So .filter or .find is technically looping over an array, but they all have different end objectives at the end of it. So there are certain functions like for each, for of, .map that are all kind of your classic ways of looping over things. It all depends on what your end objective is. Because our end objective here was to maintain a string and keep adding on to it, the for of is what I gravitated to. Does that mean that you couldn't do it with a for each, or that a for each would have been better? Not necessarily, right? Like you could accomplish it with any of those methods. It's just a matter of which one is closest, or which style kind of makes most sense to you. The problem with a lot of for each loops is you get what is called callback hell, where you get nested functions deep, and then you run into some scope issues there. So that's why I personally am not a for each fan. I think the for of syntax is a little bit clearer, but that doesn't mean that you're wrong to use a for each. It just, again, depends on what you're trying to accomplish.
Can you do another example using template literals so I
Yep.
have a better understanding of it?
Actually, we just did one down here. Okay. So right here, we had our dog and our cat, right? And I wanted to basically have a string that came out that said, I think dogs are cool. Well, we could achieve that with concatenation, right? And concatenation works totally fine. We could say, I think plus the animal plus an S at the end of the animal's name are cool. And what do we get? The exact same output, right? I think dogs are cool. I think cats are cool. This works fine, especially if you only have one or two variables that you're kind of just dropping into a string. But oftentimes, like we had up here, we have 1, 2, 3 different variables, and those are all getting set into a string that has a lot of different parentheses and dollar signs and all different stuff around it, right? So what the template literal allows us to do is use these backticks here, right? So we can't use that dollar sign curly brace syntax unless we have everything in the backticks instead of the single quotes or the double quotes. What that allows us to do is just type out our string the way that we would normally type out a string, but instead of having to end the string, concatenate something in, and then concatenate another string on top of it, instead what we are able to do is use that dollar sign curly brace and say, take whatever the value of animal is. In this case, it happens to be coming from our loop, so it's grabbing dog, and drop it into that string. So a template literal is basically saying, hey, the template text that I want to show up is I think S are cool. And then whenever you see the dollar sign curly brace, pause, don't actually put those letters in there. Go get the value of that variable and drop it in here. So these two are doing the exact same thing, but you can see the difference between the two. One takes a lot more letters, and especially as you're getting in here, you can see when it gets complicated when we want to use that template literal as opposed to this approach, which has lots of pluses, and we got to get the syntax right. We got to get the opening quotes and the closing quotes right, compared to this right here, where we can use quotes, we can use all different kinds of things and say, hey, this is the template, just drop these values in to get the values.
So
And yes,
why
Michael, we are still reviewing stuff from yesterday.
so why add the extra dollar sign on movie data dot price?
Great question. Because I wanted the dollar sign to show up right here. Right? I wanted a little dollar sign to show up 8 before 8, 9, 10, and 11. So the same reason of why do we need parentheses here and we don't need parentheses right here? Because I actually wanted the parentheses to show up around the price.
What about the plus and the equal sign beforehand? What
Yeah,
is that
good
there
question.
for?
So if I said equal right here and we take a look, my dropdown now only has Rugrats in it. And I'm like, well, where did all my other movies go, right? Well, if we look, Rugrats happens to be the last movie in this example. What's happening is every time this loop is running, we have to keep in mind that this options line right here does not happen one time. What the computer does is it goes, all right, object.entries, go get the first movie title and the first movie data. So that gets filled with the Godfather and the data about the movie. So when we come down here, the first time this runs, it goes screw whatever was in options, take this new option, generate out this template literal, store it in options. Great. Now do we come down here? No. Because this curly brace still has us inside of our for loop. So our for loop is now saying, okay, what else happens here? We go back up and we get the next movie title and the next data about that, store that in movie data, Now, again, take whatever was in options, forget about it, set it equal to this new option here. So what options plus equal is doing is the same thing of saying this. Take options and set it equal to whatever options is currently equal to plus this new template literal that we want to add on there. So that does the exact same thing, but the shorthand for this is to say, hey, take options and add to it whatever is currently there plus this new thing.
Yeah, I think the extra credit really does help me when learning like the plus equal sign because I didn't know you could do that. Well, that and like I think minus equals and then the star equals and I don't know I kind of forgot about the division one. I think it's just
A slash
yeah
equals.
slash.
Yeah, so what you can basically do is say like const my num equals 3, and then gotta make that a let because we're gonna modify it. And then say my num times equals 4, and then console log my num, and we get 12 out, right? So you're basically saying, hey, this is the same thing as saying my num equals my num times 4. I honestly have never seen anyone ever use anything other than the plus equal because it's helpful for string concatenation, but all of them do technically work. Okay, other questions? Throw them in chat. You can DM them to me if you don't want to pipe up. I just pop open Slack and make sure there's nothing in there either. Okay, looking good there. Any other questions about this or general questions that this inspired? Remember when you were going through that admissions process and we had that question of how many hours a week do you expect to dedicate to this? This is why we get into that question, right? Because you go 12 hours a week, 12 hours a week of class time. That's a lot, but I can do that. And then you get to the end of class and you're like, oh, we did a lot and I think I'm staying up, but am I really getting this, right? And yes, we'll have more projects and yes, we're only at the halfway point, but this is where you go, hey, just coding along, just following along in class is not enough, right? And it's not just the homework, it's, hey, am I actually understanding this? And if the answer to that is I don't know, that is something that you probably want some one-on-one attention, right? And you can say, hey, this is how I'm understanding this code. Is that right? And a great way of assessing that is by actually deleting out, make a copy of your code, and then delete out all of my comments, right? And do that same exact exercise that I do during class. Because we're not expecting you to be able to do this on a project from scratch all on your own yet. And as you get more full stack practice, that will build and you will be able to do that. But the level of understanding that we want to be shooting for here is, can I read the code that we wrote in class tonight and describe it the way Max does in those comments? If you are not hitting that level, that is the ultimate self-assessment to say, I need to be sinking more time into class. I need to be rewatching the videos. I need to be using that list of additional resources. I need to be finding the style that works for me. Lots and lots of stuff going on there, right? So that is where you go, all right, my 12 hours is only a little more than half of my time that I said I would dedicate to this boot camp. If you're hitting all those comments and you're being in the and you're able to do that at only 12 hours of class time, great. But hold yourself to that benchmark, right? Say, can I write those comments myself? Because if I can't, that's when all of that additional time is going to get sunk into this, right? We're going to help as many as you as we can across the finish line to get you to graduation, but it's up to you guys to say, am I learning enough to actually get my career started in this? Because you can coast all the way through to the end, and we'll catch you on a couple things on grading and help you out, not encouraging you to do that, but this is up to you guys to say, I'm sinking a buttload of time into just sitting in class and listening and following along, but am I really squeezing this opportunity and really making sure everything that I'm squeezing is actually soaking into my brain? Joe, I'm glad you finally got in. Was it something that you had to do, or was it a Google issue? Okay,
Not a clue.
I'm going to write that off as a Google issue. Google has some weird protocols with like injecting an SSH key into the cloud VM, and that seems to be problematic more than you think.
I hit restart like 6 times, and then 2 hours later I got in. So I'm gonna chalk it up to I have no idea.
Okay, works for me. Yeah, I'm like, we really don't lock down your computers. I mean, like, we have them enrolled in like the business manager, so we can like remotely lock them. But in terms of like locking you out of admin access or anything like that, like you need all of that as a developer, so it doesn't make much sense to lock you out of it. Okay, let's switch over to stand up. How are we feeling in general? What did we learn yesterday? How are we feeling about the movie project? What did we accomplish?
Um, we learned about like the row iterator and how we can make the seats. I think show 8.
Yeah.
Like you set it at 0, then if it gets to 7, it starts over.
Yeah, first time that we've kind of written a for loop that wasn't going over an existing array, right? So we I don't want to call them an old school for loop because we definitely still use them a lot, but a way to write a loop to run what we would say an arbitrary number of times or a set number of times that we come up with. So you can kind of play around with that loop and have it generate out 16 seats if you wanted to instead of 8, right? But we got into that nested data structure for the first time for sure. What else from yesterday?
I think I'm just feeling more confident in general with my understanding of what's going on. I think I'm taking the exact opposite approach that Harry does, and taking like the comments out and explaining the code to like Chat GPT, and it's kind of like, yeah, you got it right, or you sort of right.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a totally valid approach, right? Of you know, having someone else explain it and having it sink in. We still want to get to the point where you know, you can still explain it yourself, but having multiple different sources explain that to you is also totally fine. Anything else from yesterday that we wanted to talk about, to discuss? Any light bulb moments, any defuck moments? Okay. I am going to finish out commenting the code from yesterday because we did not get a chance to finish out all of that existing code. And then I will finally get the day 2 folder set up. We will do the live share. We'll go after all of that. Okay. So where did we leave off? We left off with number 10. So what did we get up to in our code? We got up to, hey, when this page first loads, we're going to have this data structure that just the JavaScript can keep track of this information. We're going to reach in and grab this selector. we are going to make a new array called options. We're going to loop over all of the data, convert our object into an array so that we can loop over all of that data and generate out our string of all the options. And then we finally take that string of the options that we generated right here and shove it into the inner HTML. What is the end goal of all of that? That means that when we click on that dropdown, not only do our movies show up here, but because we wrote a for loop to go over all of the movies, whenever I update the data up here, it will automatically change my dropdown based off of that data. So when we talk about the ultimate source of truth, the one source of truth, everything is firing off of this movies object. Okay, what else did we do? Well, we did a lot of work down here to generate out all of the seats, but we haven't quite documented out what all of that is doing. So we're going to hold off on this on change because we're not really doing anything with that on change yet. So what I'm going to do is I am going to say number 11, loop over all of the values from the movies object on number 2. From number 2. So go up here. We don't care about the titles right now. All we care about is getting access to those individual seats. So what do? We say, hey, don't give me the keys and don't give me the object.entries because I don't need the title and the values. All I care about is the values themselves. So now we come down here and we say 12. For each movie, start a loop that will run 8 times. How do we know it's going to run 8 times? We start our row iterator at 0. We say every time this loop runs, add 1 to the iterator, and once that row iterator is if that row iterator is less than or equal to 8, keep running the loop. If it is not, stop running this loop. We are done. We also we say number 13, create an empty array. So we have a place to store each column of seats. Haven't put anything in it yet, but we need to start it out as empty, so there's something that we can push it into. 14. Write a yep. This live share link is only for the commenting code. There will be a new live share link for day 2 when I change the folder. So if you want to join that live share, you definitely can. And I'll put these comments up in GitHub as well. Write a for loop that also runs 8 times for each of the columns. Push an empty object, which will eventually include the seat data for all 8 columns and all 8 rows. Well, how do I know it's for all 8 columns and all 8 rows? Because this row.push is nested inside this for loop, which is nested inside this for loop, which is nested inside this for loop. So this row.push will not only run 8 times another 8 for each one of the rows, which is 64 times, but times 4 because we have 4 different movies loaded into our movie data. And all 4 movies. Then number 16, after generating the entire 8 cols of seats, push the row we generated into the seats key of the movie data object, which we have one of for each movie. So where's this movie data coming from? This movie data is coming all the way up from our for loop right up here. What's that for loop running over? The values of our movies. So when we say movie data.seats, we are actually accessing the seats here, 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 and here. Because those seats are already an array, when we call the dot push into them, we're taking that entire row of seats that we generated and shoving it into the movie data seats. I'm just going to take out these examples here so we don't get lost. Okay. Then we finish out the loop and we are done with our commenting of the code from yesterday. Do we have any questions on those new comments?
Hmm. Uh, so we use push to push the data. Well, row dot push.
Into the end of the seats array.
Okay.
We also use push here to push this empty object, which will represent the seat, into the row itself. Right. So if you want to think about this kind of very visually, right? What is this for loop doing? This for loop is starting at the back of the theater and it's literally placing the seat there, that innermost for loop. Then that for loop runs the next time and places the next seat in place. All of that, what are we doing? We're pushing that into the row. So if our boss came in and said, "What are you doing right now?" I would say I'm placing a seat in each column of the row. Okay. When I get to the end of that column, right? When I get to the end of the column and the row, I go, okay, what am I going to do next? Well, I'm going to move on to the next row, and then I'm going to put 8 more seats in there. So this innermost for loop is actually putting the seats down. This for loop is saying I need to do that for every row in the theater. What is this for loop doing? This is saying, well, I need to do that for each theater in our movie theater, or each movie that we're showing in our movie theater. All good? Any questions? Okay, now we are finally going to get everything set up in our live share rocking and rolling. So I'm heading to my Finder. I am headed to my desktop, my code, my week 8. We're right-clicking and duplicating our day 1 and renaming it to day 2. We are popping that open in VS Code. We are going live. We are getting our index.html open and our script.js open. I'm throwing my script.js on the bottom half. Of course, you can rearrange your windows however you would like. The live share is in the chat. Give you guys a minute to get set up. Everyone good? Anyone need another minute? Okay. So we've done all of this work down here to loop over all of our seats and generate out this array of all of this mega data. But when we look at our console.log of our movies, we can see all of these seats. What we need to do is say, hey, I want all of these seats to show up when I change the dropdown. Because based off of whatever dropdown item we pick, we need to reach into the seats array and generate out all the individual seats that are supposed to show up in the interface. So if you think we've had fun with for loops before, wait until we rewrite all of those for loops to loop over all of the seats that we just generated. Let's dive into that. So I'm going to come up here and say, when do I want this to happen? I want this to happen when the movie dropdown changes. So I am going to say, hey, the selected movie is coming from the event target value. That again was coming from whatever one I pick here. Grab the value attribute from the option tag that we generated right here, and then reach into our movies and get out the selected movie. So what I am going to do is I am going to say, hey, let's store the const movie data from the movie's selected movie. Now, what do I need to do? I need to loop over each one. If I console log out our movie data, I need to target in to the seats array. So if I say dot seats, now I've eliminated the price and I'm able to see all of the seats. But we've got a problem here. Not only do we have all of these arrays, which are representing all of the columns of the seats, we also have this big array out here that is containing all of the nested arrays inside of it. This is what we call a multi-dimensional array. When an array is in another array, we need to nest into that to break it apart. So basically what we need to do here is loop over each one of the rows. So we're going to say for let row of our movie data dot seats. And we can console log out the row and now see we have broken out of this big array, which we logged out right here, and have broken that out into each individual row of seats. But now we've got another problem. We need to loop over each one of the columns of the seats as well. So in order to do that, we're going to say for let col of row and console log the col. And now you will see we have that object log out 64 times. Be very careful on our opening and closing curlies here. So we need to think about this as, hey, my end goal here is to generate out a bunch of HTML for each one of the seats. And if we look at our HTML up here, we can actually already see we've got a starting place to go off of. We have a div that contains the entire row of seats and all of the columns in that row. We also have another div that is representing, hey, this is how we start another row. So we get into JavaScript scope here, where we say, hey, when are these variables going to reset? When they reach the end of the for loops, they're going to set back to the value that we have up at the top. So what we're going to do in here is outside the for loop, outside the outermost for loop, we're going to say let seats HTML equal an empty string. Actually, you know what? We're going to make it equal. Yeah, an empty string. Sorry, I had to think about that. Now, what do we want to happen for each row that we generate? Well, if we look for each row, we put a new div in place. So we're going to go inside the let row, but not inside the let column. We're inside the for loop, but not the innermost nested for loop. And we're going to say we're going to say seats HTML plus equal, add on to whatever is already in the seats HTML, a new div. What do we want to happen after we generate out each column of all of those divs? We want to add in our closing div tag. Be very careful on where your closing curly braces are here. We're saying, hey, seats HTML starts out empty. From there, what do we want to happen for each row? Well, at the beginning of the loop, we want you to add in an empty div. At the closing, after we generate all of the columns, we want you to add in the closing div for this HTML. Finally, what do we want you to add for each one of the columns as we're looping over them? We want you to add a chair. So we are going to say seats HTML plus equals our span of a chair. And finally, we're going to do outside of our for loop, document, get element by ID, reach into the seats up here, and set the inner HTML equal to the seats HTML that we generated in this for loop. We save, we come over, we pick a movie, and if your code is working, you should see all 64 seats show up in your browser. We're definitely going to pause there and poll. Try and leave all this code up on the screen. To note, your seats will not show up until you change the movie in the dropdown. when you change the movie in the dropdown, you should see 8 columns of seats and 8 rows of seats as well. It'd be very disappointing if at least one of you didn't need help debugging at this point.
I could also mean you're a great teacher. Just saying.
Yeah, I'm trying to debug mine now because it's saying C HTML is not defined, but I'm gonna try to do it on my own.
Same. I'm also debugging. Please hold.
Give you a couple minutes. This is probably the trickiest nested for loop that we're at here, right? So definitely take a couple minutes here, let you work through it. If you do have yours working, read through that code, right? Can you say why we're using those syntax things? Can you say how many times each one of those for loops is running? Can you read this code as if the computer were processing it? Take that time, if you do have your code running, to try and get to that level of understanding. Placement of every curly brace matters here. So you may have a line of code that is just inside or outside of a curly brace, and that is causing your error.
Be able to help me out?
Of course, go for it.
I figured mine out.
Nice work. Don't forget to vote in the poll.
Trying to see why this wasn't working here, why it's on this.
So it is working. What we are pushing in for each one of the seats down here is just an empty object. And so that when you're logging out the column, all you're doing is logging out the empty object that we had in place.
Ah, I see. Okay. I was looking for this, but here, I see.
Yep.
Okay. I gotcha.
11 of 15 voted in. Give you guys one more minute. Of course, you're welcome to ask for help.
Got it.
Nice. All right. Anyone need help going once?
I think I do. I mean, it's
Okay.
showing up, but I have an error.
Okay, share your screen.
Yeah. Mm-mm-mm.
Cannot read properties of undefined reading seat. Okay. Can you request remote? And can you drag your code over for me as well?
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Okay. So we start with the error, and the error is saying it's happening on line 54. So that's where we will start. We are saying log out the movie data.seats. That is coming from the selected movie. So let's see what's going on with our selected movie first. So if we console log that out, and then pick a movie, Interestingly enough, you notice we don't get that error message here. So if we pick a different movie, we don't get the error message. And if we pick the first movie, we still don't get the error message. So I'm guessing what happens is that when you were in here, you just clicked on the first movie. Nope. All right, I'm stumped. How did you get that error message to show up?
I don't know.
I think that that is something we can ignore because we're not getting it anymore. I wonder what happened is if you use that drop down and then wrote more code and it still stuck around. So you had already fixed it, but the log was still showing it in the
Oh,
history.
oh, okay, okay.
So I think you're good to go. Of
Thank you.
course. Anyone else need help?
Take a look at mine, Max.
Yep, go for it. Okay, so you are really close to having it all work. You did all of the work to start the seats HTML as empty. You added in the proper opening and closing divs. For each one of the columns, you added in the chair. Everything is good to go. The last thing you need to do is say, hey, once we are done looping over everything, go back to our HTML document, get the element by ID of seats, and set the inner HTML of the seats equal to the seats HTML that we just generated. And now when we change it, we get all of our seats.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. Anyone else need help? Going once, going twice. Okay. Couple of housekeeping things we need to do. Head over to attendance. Tonight's secret word is seats. SEATS. Head over to attendance. Secret word is seats. Once you are done with attendance, head back over into Zoom, and there should be a poll showing up. This is just to gauge your interest in office hours. If you would prefer them to be in person, you can pick the first option. If you would like to attend them, but would only like but can only attend it virtually, pick the second option. If you're like, screw you, I hate you, I don't want to spend any more time with you, 12 hours is enough, pick the third option. And then if you have picked the first or second option in question number 1, just check off the times that would work for you. But if you are not interested in attending office hours, you think you got this on your own, that is totally fine. Just don't pick any of the answers in number 2. Give you guys a minute to vote in those. Realize you might have to pull up your calendars to check. That's totally fine. If they were in person, they would be down at Common Space. Attendance secret word is seat or seats. SEATS. Most of you have voted in. Okay, thanks. All of you have voted in. Thank you for that. Let me screenshot this before I forget about it and poll. Okay. Looks like Sunday at 10 a.m. would be the best time for you guys. And it looks like a couple of you guys would like to do it in person. So what I will say is I will be at Common Space Sunday, June 9th at 10 a.m. There is free coffee at Common Space, so if you would like to come get very caffeinated with me, you are more than welcome to do that. I will say that I will only do them in person if we get people actually showing up for them. So we will use this as a trial run. I will also open up this Zoom classroom and have it recorded as well. If you would like to attend in person, you totally can. If you would like to attend virtually, it will be in the same Zoom link. I will post a reminder in Slack like 30 minutes beforehand. You can join in on Zoom. And I have 0 objectives for these office hours. So believe it or not, I come in with no projects prepared. This is just your opportunity to bounce questions off of me. And because they are recorded on Zoom, oftentimes people will say like, "Oh darn, I can't make it at that time." Just shoot me a message in Slack. And it can be the night before or whatever with your list of questions, and then I can answer those questions in the Zoom recording, and then and then the Zoom recording will be on YouTube, that you can like go back and review it and get your questions answered that way as well. So we will try them in person for the first one, Sunday 10 a.m. At Common Space. I will probably be in the conference room, but we'll figure something out. And then we will go from there. Because it's first office hours, I will also try and bring donuts if I remember, but don't hold me to that. Okay, any questions about office hours? Maybe ducks, maybe. Okay. Let me close that and that. Nope, you're gonna make me log in. I will do that later. Okay. So let's just do one more review of all of the code that's going on here before we move on. There was a question of why don't we just do document.getElementById right here? Well, the answer to that is document.getElementById is what we call costly, right? What do we mean by costly? It just is more intensive for the computer to constantly be reaching back into the HTML. So what we do instead is we start out a string. And to our JavaScript, even though we're putting HTML syntax into it, right now, the JavaScript is like, I don't care. It's just letters to me. I don't care if you're putting HTML in this. I don't care if it's numbers. I don't really care. It's just a string. So we start out an empty placeholder string. We need to do that outside of our for loop, because if we did it inside the for loop, every time that loop runs, it would reset the HTML. So we do an empty placeholder string here. We say, hey, create our opening div tag and our closing div tag, not for every column, but for every row. And we know we need to do that because if we look at our HTML up here, we have this div tag here with each one of the spans in here. So this opening div is matching up to this opening div right here. This closing div is matching up to this closing div right here. Okay, what about all of these chairs that we need to generate? Well, we need to do that for each one of the columns in our row. So we write our other for loop right here. And we say, okay, now what do we want to add on to the seats HTML? We do our plus equals because we want to add on to whatever is existing in that seats HTML. We don't want to override it. And then we add in our span tag with the individual chair on there. So it's not necessarily that we're targeting the span tags or doing any of that. All we're doing is generating out a really long string. And in fact, if we log out our seats HTML right before we set it into the HTML and pick a movie, you can see this very long string comes out. Well, if we look at that very long string, we can see our opening div tag, we will actually have our 8 band tags for all of our chairs. And we will also find at some point our closing div tag that we add in. Well, then why is there another opening div tag right here? Because this div tag gets added for each row, just like this closing div tag does. Now, once we've done all of that work to generate out that string, we reach into the document, get the element of seats out, go to the inner HTML, and then say, hey, here's one big blob of HTML. Figure out how to make all of this stuff show up. If instead we did that right in here and did our document.getElementById.innerHTML plus equals and then this string, what would end up happening is we ask our HTML document for every one of these seats, here, make the seat show up, here, make the seat show up, here, make the seat show up. Compared to doing it outside of our for loop, we then instead say, hey, here's a grid of 64 seats. Please make all 64 of these show up at the same time. Does that make sense? You have any questions?
The document that get by these seats, I put it outside of the for loop, and that's why I had an error. I didn't
Well, it should be outside of the for loop, but inside of the on change.
yeah, I had it outside on the on change.
That will do it. Joe, what's up?
So just to clarify, the reason you did documents.going by ID outside of the those for loops was efficiency reasons. It's just to keep it
Exactly.
loading at
Yes.
the same time. Okay.
Yes. Yeah, so we could have, instead of using seats HTML, we could have just said that, right? We could have used our document get element by ID inner HTML every place we have our seats HTML. But even then, that would work fine here. But right here, it would get really confused because it would be like, here's an opening div. Where's the closing div, right? And so instead, we are basically saying, let's do the hard work in the JavaScript string first, get it all put together, figure out all of the seats. Once we have all of those seats figured out, now we can set that in. Okay. 5 minutes left. What we've got going on here is almost what we want, but if we look at the finished product, and I'm going to drop the link of that in the chat, we notice our screen doesn't show up and none of our seats show up either. So we need to clean that up one tiny little bit more. We're going to go into our HTML, and as painful as it is, all of this HTML is now getting generated by our JavaScript. So we don't actually need anything inside of the seats. So we can actually clear that out. We do need that div ID seats to stay there though. Why do we need essentially that empty div? Because we target the seats right here. So we still need a hole that our JavaScript can reach into to dump our HTML into. So we leave our div ID seats there. And then we've got one more thing that we got to deal with. That screen shouldn't show up until we pick our movie. So we need to figure out how to move that into our JavaScript. So what we're going to do is say, hey, once you are done generating out all of the seats, before you set that inner HTML, I want to add one more thing to the seats HTML. I would like to add our div ID screen. Now, this is where a template literal can really come in handy. If we tried to put the seats HTML and add on to it our screen as a string, we'd run into a problem. This has quotes in it. This has double quotes in it. So don't follow me on this yet. If I borrow this screen and throw it into a string here, JavaScript gets really confused. Again, don't follow me on this yet, because it sees an opening quote and sees this closing quote and thinks I'm done with that string. So I'm like, that's not what I want to do. There are two ways of solving this. We could use single quotes here, and that would solve the problem. Or we can use a template literal instead and use those backticks. So whenever we're working with HTML in our JavaScript as a string, it is often encouraged that we use them as backticks. And you will notice I did that as well up here. So I can use those double quotes as long as I know I won't be using any double quotes inside the HTML itself. But in general, you can avoid all of those problems by using a backtick instead. So now you can follow me on that. We are going to, after we generate out all of our seats, we are going to put the div ID screen back in place. And then we can add in our inner HTML. So if we save, come over here, pick our movie, we get all of our seats showing up and our screen. And with all of that said, we are going to go on break and be back at 7:25. I will stick around for the next 2 minutes if you have any questions. Otherwise, I will see you at 7:25.
I have a question.
Shoot.
All right, so I can't get this seat stuff right. I've been trying and trying and trying, and it just ain't working for me.
All right, share screen.
Yeah. That's yours. Screen one.
Okay. Okay, so I don't see anything wrong with the for loop that's generating the seats, so that's good.
Yeah, it's not duplicating the seats how everyone else is when I select the movie. It just normal.
Okay, can you take me to your browser?
Yes. I'll just bring it over here.
You
Oh.
may have to come out of full screen mode first.
Okay.
And then in Zoom, did you? Oh, never mind. That worked. Okay. So let me see. We're gonna pick a movie. Okay. So the biggest thing we want to do is make sure we have our JavaScript console open because it may be trying to tell us something and showing us an error that we can't see unless we have it open. In this case, we didn't get so lucky. We do have our object that has our seats. That is all generated out. So that tells me the problem isn't with anything down here. All of that
That's
is working.
yours. That's yours.
Oh.
Let me see.
Yeah, can you switch that over?
Yeah. Come on. All right. So this is the one of mine.
Okay, so that what we saw in here is that all of that is actually working. So we know that the problem isn't in there. So we can narrow it down to here. And what you have is a on charge instead of an on change.
Wow.
See if that fixes it.
All right. And it does.
Good to go.
All right. Thank you.
Of course. Anyone else need help? Or actually, let's go on break. And if you do need help, I will help you after break. So where did we leave off? We left off on our drop down is working. We can pick a movie. We get our seats to generate. Our screen shows up. We're in good shape here. What is the next thing that we are working on? Well, we did all of this work, right, in this giant for loop to keep track of all of these objects. Well, why did we do objects? One, it was a placeholder, but two, when we're in one of our movies, we would like half of these seats to show up as occupied. And then we also need to make it so that if we click on these seats, they turn blue so that we know that we have selected them. And it also shows us down here at the bottom, hey, we have seats selected and a little checkout button going on, right? So I now need to work on, we've got two things we got to tackle, right? Let's do that first one where we want half of the seats to be filled in as occupied. So what we can do is say, hey, in our row.push, all the way down in our for loop, when we're generating out all of those different seats, we want to say half of those are going to be occupied. So what we do, 1 second. Is when we push it in here, we're going to add a property, a key called occupied. And we want that to be randomly generated. And we'll make it so half the seats are occupied. So we did get a little taste of math.random. And what we're going to do is we're going to do like an inline if statement almost. We're going to say if math.random is less than 0.5. Remember, math.random always returns a decimal between 0 and 1. So half the time it will be less than 1, the other, or half the time it will be under 0.5, the other half the time it will be above 0.5. And in order to make sure this is working, we have our console.log movies down at the bottom. If we save that and come back over and look at our inspect, you can ignore the favicon, open up the object, open up any one. Oh, sorry, I'm on the wrong one. Open up the object down at the bottom, pop open one of these seats, and now you'll see we have a long list of whether or not the seats are occupied or not. So I'm like, okay, that data is kind of cool. It's chilling in our JavaScript, but we need some way of showing that that seat is occupied to the end user, right? Well, where do we do that? This is all of our data. This is actually generating out the information, but this is where we actually display the seat to the end user. So what we're able to do here is add in an additional class. So I'm going to make sure that this is in a template literal, that I'm using backticks instead of single or double quotes. And then I'm going to use my $ curly braces there. Now it's saying pause in the template literal. I want you to evaluate out some JavaScript. What JavaScript do I want you to evaluate? I want you to say, hey, if this column is occupied, and we're going to combine both our template literal and what we call a ternary operator. So a ternary operator, excuse me, is like an inline if statement. What we do is we say, hey, whatever to the left of the question mark is what we are checking to see if this thing is true. If this seat is occupied, literally add the class occupied. Otherwise, don't add anything. Okay. So what did we do? We added in this occupied down here, and we said, hey, generate a random number between 0 and 1. And if it's less than 0.5, the seat will not be occupied. If it's greater than 0.5, it will be occupied. Then we come up here, and in our span, we make sure it is in a template literal first. Once we do know that it's in a template literal, we dive a step deeper and we add this $ curly brace. And this $ curly brace, because it is in a template literal, goes, okay, you want me to run some JavaScript. What JavaScript do you want me to run? I want you to check if the call that is coming from the loop of looping over all the rows, the rows are coming from all of the seats. So we're accessing this occupied value from all the way down here in our math.random. And we're saying if the seat is occupied, then add the word occupied to the list of all the classes. If it is not occupied, then make it an empty string. So I save, I come over, I click on a movie, and nothing looks like it has changed. But if we go into inspect here, we can see there are a bunch of classes of occupied on some of the seats because we made it random. So the last thing we need to do, we added that class in. Now we just need to tell it what does the occupied class look like. So we're going to pop open our style.css. And all we need to do is add a new class called occupied that sets the color to red. And if we save, we should see our seats now turn red. Three-step process there. First, update the JavaScript down at the bottom to say when we generate out the seat, let's figure out if it is going to be occupied or not. Step number 2, add in a template literal up in our JavaScript that is generating out each individual seat to say, look to see if the seat is occupied. And if it is, add the word occupied. Otherwise, don't add anything. Step 4, we make sure that we can see our occupied seats in the browser. And step 5, we go into our style.css, modify that occupied, and set the color to red.
Can you share the live share again, please?
Does anyone not have their red chairs working or need another minute?
I need another
I need
minute.
another minute.
Yep, no problem.
Yeah, same here.
Just to confirm what we're doing here. So row.push is pushing a new object with the key of occupied and the value of math.random less than 0.5 to randomize
so-
to like 50% of the seats.
Yeah, it's basically true or false.
Okay. Wanted to make sure I understand the syntax that was going on there.
Yeah.
Is there a not that it's like a big deal. Is there a reason why you don't need to declare each key individually? Like I understand, like I think the like setting the object is essentially declaring that they're going to be keys. Is that like something that's specific to JavaScript, or do most languages do that?
Well, when we create this object, we are setting what the keys are. You
I
say,
mean more specifically, like using like setting it, like declaring it like a const or a let or something. Like I know it's like waiting for a key when you create an object. Is it just because is it JavaScript that doesn't require you to declare individually like that, and just the syntax is just commas, or is this syntax pretty universal with most languages?
are you kind of trying to ask about like anonymous variables being able to create a variable without assigning a name to it? Or are you saying more, is it unique that you can add keys to objects after they've been created?
No, just specifically with like I mean, I guess it would be like similar to anonymous variables, but within like the object, like the syntax in JavaScript is you make an object with the curly braces.
Mhm.
You can declare the new object that way, and then what I'm assuming is happening is JavaScript is waiting for you um, to do something colon something comma.
Mhm.
Um, is that the syntax for almost every language, or is that just for JavaScript?
The syntax itself is just for JavaScript. So like in Python, they call them dictionaries instead of objects, right? So in Python, a dictionary, okay, does look very similar to JavaScript. But in Java, an object is slightly different because you need to um declare the variable types.
That was my question.
So yes, it is language specific. Um and then something like Ruby, an object may use different syntax. Um So you get into object-oriented programming, which is like a whole nother thing, but not every language calls it the same thing. Not every language uses the same syntax. Statically typed languages like Java require variable types to be declared. Uh, and then other languages like Python may call it a dictionary when it would be an object in JavaScript.
Where it's like essentially a waiting for a string, and it knows that every time you put something in there initially before that colon, and after a comma, if there was one, that's always going to be a string,
Correct.
and then the next thing is whatever the variable is.
Yep, very, very syntax specific. Okay, so if we look at our array, there's a question. Can you explain the row.push occupied math.random 0.5? We want to break this into two separate steps. What are we doing in this section of the code? We're looping over all the movies, all of the rows, and all of the columns. So in other words, we're just trying to generate out all of the seats that we're keeping track of in our object of objects of arrays of the seats, right? And so when we get all the way down there, we want to store multiple pieces of information about the seat. Excuse me. What are the two pieces of information that we will be storing? One is whether or not the seat is occupied, and the other is going to be if that seat is selected. Because we need to keep track of multiple pieces of information about the same thing, and because we want to access that data by the title and not necessarily by the number of items in the list, we use an object. Right now, we're only keeping track of one piece of information, whether or not the seat is occupied. So if we look at what is getting generated out for each one of our seats is that object, but you'll see some of them are true and some of them are false. How is that happening? Well, what math.random is doing is it's generating a random number. So let's say the random number is 0.25135, right? What we do here is say, is 0.25135 less than 0.5? It is, so occupied gets set to true here. Now, the next time we run into the next column, it generates a random number and it's 0.75. And we go, well, that's not less than 0.5, so the seat is not occupied. It will be false. So that is just the data side of generating out the true or false. But that alone isn't enough to connect that and show that to the user. So what we have to do is go back up here and say, hey, when we're actually generating out each one of the span tags, look to see if that column, if that seat is occupied. If it is occupied, then literally add the word occupied. we could make this whatever class name that we wanted to, as long as that class name matches up in our CSS right here. So it's kind of a 3-step process of generate the data with math.random and store it in an object. Then when we're generating out the HTML for that, we now need to add in a CSS class so that it knows that it's occupied. And then finally, in our CSS, we have to tell it what occupied looks like. All right, everyone good? Any questions?
Can you help me
Mhm.
get my red seats to pop up?
Go for it.
All right, 1 second.
I figured it out how to get mine going. You might probably might have to check on the HTML. There's like a, you gotta be careful with, like, there's like a double quote. You have to change it because that's literally what I did.
I thought it was my first. I've spelled occupied wrong multiple times. So that was that.
Well, if you spelled
Um,
it wrong consistently, it's not a problem.
No, it was inconsistent. It was not good.
All right, so let's first we want to go through this kind of the order that the computer is doing it. So we start down here and we say, hey, is it occupied if the math.random is less than 0.5? So all of that is good. Then we come back up to where we generate out all of our seats. And we say, is the col occupied? If it is, add the word occupied. Otherwise, don't add anything. That is in a template literal, so that's got your backtick. So that is good. The last thing we need to do is check our style.css and make sure we've got our occupied. We do, but what are we adding occupied to?
The seats.
The seats, span tag, but what in particular?
Is it their ID?
It's not.
Oh.
Where do we add the word occupied to?
I'm not sure.
The class.
Oh, the class.
And so all we need
So
to do.
did I not put that hashtag? I'm supposed to put a hashtag.
Well, no, hashtags for ID. Period is for class.
Oh, is it the period? Oh, it's been too long. I forgot.
Go check in your browser,
Wow.
see if
Okay,
that
that
fixed
makes
it.
sense.
We didn't use
Oh,
ID
it
because
did.
we're going to have multiple seats that are occupied, right? So if we added an ID of occupied, the browser would get kind of cranky and be like, hey, that ID is repeating. Anyone else need
Thank you.
help?
Yes, I can't get the live share, Max. I didn't receive it. I don't know if it's something on
Oh,
my end or what.
sorry. Nope. I sent it as a direct message and said to everyone. Totally my bad. Try that
We're
again.
good.
There we
You
go.
know, I had a question about the last step before break, but I guess I got back kind of late. I wanted to go over that one more time.
What section?
I think it was in the HTML. It was in the seat ID, I believe. It's okay if not. We could just go over it at the end.
So our div ID seats has been emptied out here because we're generating this in our JavaScript.
It was the next step. I got that. I got that actually.
Okay, so from there, but it was before break. I'm not quite sure where it was. This was our next step was to generate it all out based off of the for loop.
All right, section 77 or row 77. All right, I'll take a look at that.
Okay.
You're fine.
Yep. Let me know if you have questions at the
good.
end. Happy to review.
All right.
Okay. So we are making good progress here, right? We've got our movie theater seat showing up. We've got it all based off of our JavaScript data. We're feeling pretty good about that. We're using document object model. We're using objects. We're using arrays. We're using functions. What functions are we using? Hey, this on change is a function. How do I know it's a function? Well, one, it's got the arrow here. The other thing is saying, hey, we want this entire chunk of code, this block of code to run when the movie changes. Well, that is not only a function, that is also an event because it starts with the word on, and we're using the document object model all the way up here, get element by ID, to get that movie dropdown to attach the on change event. So we've got functions, we've got events, we've got for loops, we've got objects and arrays, we've got template literals, we've got accessing data in arrays using keys, we have dynamic keys, we have I don't know. I think that's most of everything that we've got covered here. So give yourself some credit here, right? Because these are a lot of JavaScript concepts that are all kind of coming together. Terry.
So why do we like use like map.random? Isn't there like another method for like random? Like, or is it just
If you know one, feel free to tell me. No, I really do not know of any other random methods off the top of my head.
oh okay.
Math is like a built-in keyword, right? Just like object is dot here. That's just like built into the JavaScript library. And math does have functions other than random. So it's got like dot floor, which will like drop off a decimal point. It's got dot round, which will obviously round up or down. It's got dot min and dot max if you want to find like the biggest or smallest number in an array. Typical math stuff. I think there's dot pow, which does like an exponential thing. But I don't know of any other random function in JavaScript that we could use instead.
So if there's like something that wasn't built in the JavaScript, you will have to do like what, like import or something like that. Does import is a thing in JavaScript?
It will
Or
be in a couple weeks.
oh, okay, never mind. I'm getting ahead of myself. Never mind.
It isn't in the browser right now, but when we get into React, we will be getting into imports and we will be learning about NPM packages and how to install them. So NPM is like pip for Python. And so we certainly will be covering that. Yes.
In the math.random,
Yep.
is did you do it less than 0.5 because one would be like too much and it would
One
make
would
most red?
be 100% of the time.
Oh,
0.25 would be 25% of the time because the number it
it's
generates is always a decimal between 0 and 1. So
okay.
statistically, I mean, no, exactly half the seats will not be read every single time, but it will be roughly half the seats because of the statistics of random numbers.
Okay. And it assigns a number to every single seat.
Hold that thought.
Oh,
It
okay.
it assigns true or false to every single seat based off of the random number it generates being less than 0.5.
Okay. I understand that. It's like a layer. It's like
Yeah,
layers of abstractness.
yeah. So it is generating a random number for each seat, and then it is saying, is that random number less than 0.5? If it is, we're gonna say that seat is occupied, and then we're gonna forget about that number and just remember whether or not the seat is occupied, true or false.
Okay. Thank you.
So yes, it is generating a number. We're going to get into, well, how do we keep track of all of those seats and access each individual seat in a second. So let's play around with that a little bit. I am going to say, hey, I'm just curious, right? I want to get the second seat down and I want to get 3 seats over. And so give me a second. I want to test something. Don't actually know if this will work. Okay, it will. Cool. So every time that we refresh this page, you will notice that the seats change around a little bit, right? It is truly random. We don't have a method yet. We will in the next project, but we don't have a method yet of storing any of this data beyond the page refresh. And so what happens is whenever we modify our JavaScript, the live server is going, oh, that code has changed. Let me auto refresh the page for you. And we can kind of lose access to some of this data. However, so far in the console, we've only seen output of the console from our code, right? Well, it turns out we can actually access the data that we have written into our JavaScript right in the console. So we can actually say console.log and put in our movies. And what comes out once we hit the enter button to run that line of code is all of our data. Well, we can practice peeling back the layers of our data right in our console. So we can say console.log movies, and I am working on Planet of the Apes. So I'm going to say Planet of the Apes. Keep in mind your spelling is important here, especially around casing. I have of the and all lower, so I need to match that here. And now when I hit enter, I only get that object back. Okay, well, I can practice working on this. I can say dot seats, and now I get only my seats. What we haven't had practice on, though, is the interdimensional array, right? Or multi-dimensional array. What happens when I want to get a specific seat? I know that the 1, 2, 3, 4th seat row down and 1, 2, 3 seats over happens to be occupied. How do I get access to that information? Well, what I'm going to do is I need to zero index it. So I'm still going to use my square brackets, but I need to say 0, 1, 2, 3. So if I say 3 on that and hit enter, I get 8 seats back. And if I pop those open, I can actually see false, true, 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 false, false. Well, what did I say? I wanted the 3rd index, so the 4th row. 0, 1, 2, 3. Look at the 0 index, occupied is false. Look at the 1st index, occupied is true. So this data is representing this entire row. That means that if I want to get this specific chair, I can console log out not only the 3rd row, but the 0, 1, 2 index. And if I hit enter on that, I get my occupied true. So what I'm able to do is now I'm peeling back layers and layers here. I'm starting all the way up with my movies. Then I'm diving into Planet of the Apes right here. Then I'm diving into my seats right here. And then not only is seats an array that I can access the specific row index, but each one of those rows has another array in them with all of those seats. That is the column. So I access that column index, and then finally I can say dot occupied and get true. That also means that I can pick something like the 0 index row, our 1st row, and target the first index, which is the 2nd seat, and I get occupied false. And we know that because it is not showing up as red right here. All of that is going to matter in a second, because the next step that we need to work on is when I click on one of these seats, I want it to turn blue so that I know that it has been selected. How do we add something so some JavaScript runs when something happens?
Event listener.
And that event that we're listening for is a click. So we can add event listeners lots of different ways, but we're already generating out this super fancy span tag right here. So what we can do is we can just add an on click that says seat clicked that gets the event. Okay, now that we've added that seat clicked, if we actually try to run it and we click on one of the seats, we get an error that says seat click is not defined. Well, this is actually HTML that is trying to call back into our JavaScript. So we're going to go all the way down to the bottom of the page and add a const seat clicked that gets the event and console.logs seat clicked. Again, make sure you've got your casing matching your on-click event that you just added above. If we save that, come over, pick a movie, and click on a seat, we should have seat clicked showing up. Okay, now we get into something interesting. Our end goal is something that is very easy to say in a sentence. Our goal is to access our movies, go to the seat that was clicked on, and set selected to true. Seems pretty easy to do, but we have layers of data that we need to work through on that. Think about this as we're peeling back the onion, and in order to get all the way down to occupied or selected, we need to work through each one of these layers. The first layer that we need to work through is what movie is selected. So what we're going to do is say, hey, const movie dropdown is equal to document get element by ID. And we need to find that selector, which is movie selection. And in JavaScript, we can do something called function chaining, right? Or value chaining. So I could get the movie dropdown and store it there, and then go get the value of that dropdown and store that in a new variable. Or we can kind of start to combine these steps. So instead of calling this movie dropdown, I'm going to call this selected movie. And then right at the end here, just like we can chain all of these properties right here, we can also just throw the dot value on there. Then I'm going to console log out my selected movie just to make sure it's working. So I save, I come over here, I click on my dropdown, I pick my movie, and now I see not what I was expecting to see. Oh, sorry. When I click on my seat, I see the movie that I had selected. Right? Because this console log is on the seat clicked, this seat clicked function is only running when we actually click on a seat. So we click on a seat and we get the movie that we had selected. Okay, well, I don't just care about the movie I had selected. I need to use that to get into my movies array. So I'm going to come back over here and I'm going to say const movie data is equal to go up to my movies all the way up here, my master object that's got all the data in it, then use my selected movie from my document value, my drop-down value, to get one level deeper. So I save, I come over, I test it, I click on that, And now what do I see when I console log my movie data? I see my price and my seats. Like, okay, I'm going to pause there, give you a second to catch up. So again, we have our final answer here of everything that we need to peel through. Now we've gotten down to the level and I'm like, all right, what data type is this? This is an object. So I know I'm going to use dot notation and I'm trying to get into my seats. So I'm like, all right, how do I do that? I'm going to say console log movie data dot, well, do it up here, dot seats. I save, I come over, I get in here, I click. I've got now an array of all of my rows and all of my columns. And I'm like, okay, I'm making progress. I've gotten 3 levels down here. We've started with our big movies. We went down to the selected movie based off of what was in the select. And then we got into the seats for that particular movie. We're now pulling back that data structure, getting further and further nested into it. But what is the seat that I care about? The seat that I care about is whatever one I clicked on. Where do you think I can get the data of what seat I clicked on?
You can click inspect while you're hovering over a chair.
Yeah, but all these chairs look awfully similar to me in this span, in all the spans.
You could index.
Ah, okay. Let's talk about that. I could index it. And in fact, if we go back up here to where we generate out all of those seats, we actually can get access to the index when we generate out all of those seats with everyone's favorite function, object.entries. And what does object.entries do? It now gives us access to not only the row, but also the row index. And not only do we get the row index, we also need the col index. Well, with sarcasm for you, it might be my favorite function in JavaScript of all time. Who's really to say? Okay, so a couple modifications we made here, and this, now that I've done this project 5 different times, really an easy one to get lost on. We added an array right here because object.entries is giving us 2 pieces of data back. So we need those array brackets to say, heads up, object.entries is not now only just giving us the row data, it's also giving us the index of what row we are on. So we have to put those brackets in there. And then we also add this object.entries. And now we've got the curly, the parentheses of object.entries because that's a function. And then we also have the curly braces or the parentheses of the entire for loop. Knew I should have done a cup of coffee at the beginning of class. It's all right, get through it. Then we do that same exact modification again down here. So we do another array, and instead of just getting the col, now we're getting the col index and the col, And we know we can get that because we are using object.entries right here. Well, now that we have those indexes in, we want to make sure that that is actually working. So we can go inside of our for loop in console.log, and we're going to do a template literal here to get fancy, and we'll say row colon and say row index and call and add in our call index. Nine minutes away, 8 minutes away from our documentation. Almost at the end of class. Stay with me. We added in this console log here. We come over here and take a look in our console. And when we pick a movie, look at everything that comes out. Well, we're starting with row 0 and column 0. And remember thinking about this as placing those seats in the movie theater. We do the first row, we push all of the columns in place until we have all 7, but 0 index, so 8 seats. Then what do? We go all the way back over to the second row and place all of those seats in place. So what we have proven here is that we now have access to the row index and the column index. That is really, really handy because we can sneak that information into this span tag, because if we can get it in there, we can get it out of our event when we click on it. That's the last thing that we are going to do tonight, and then we will get to documenting. Okay? So we've got to shove that information in there, and then we got to pull that information back out when we click on it. So what we're going to do is I'm going to just add some spacing here because this is getting a little hard to read. So we're going to put everything on its own little line. Makes me a little bit happier. And then we are going to say data dash. And data is a special like HTML specification that says, hey, anything data dash is something that the HTML browser doesn't need to worry about. It's a special place that developers can shove information into an HTML attribute that the browser is like, I don't know what that means, but I will keep track of it for you because it is data related to this specific span tag. So I'm going to put in 2 new attributes. I'm going to say data row index is equal to quote and add in my template literal of my row index. I am also going to add in my data call index that contains my call index in my template literal. And the cool part is because this is all in our HTML, we can see that this is working because if we go over to the browser and pick a movie, then hover over our element picker and pick some random seat, we can now see the data row index and the data call index. Okay. Well, if we've shoved all of that information into the row index and the col index, that means I should be able to pull it back out on my click. So we're going to go back down to my seat clicked, and I'm going to say const row index is equal to my event dot target, and I want to get an attribute And what attribute do I want to get? This is a new method that we have not used before in the document object model. It is a way to pull attributes out of whatever the event was the click, the target, the span that we clicked on, go into that span and get an attribute out. What attribute do we want to get out? We want to get the row index. We also would like to get the col index by going back to the same event, the same target, getting an attribute, but this time it is going to be the col index. And finally, I'm going to use all of that information to go into my row index and col index of all of the work that I just did to pull that out of here to see the details of this seat. I save, I come over, I pick my movie, I go to my console, I pick a chair, and I can see that that chair is occupied true. If I pick another seat, I can see that is occupied false.
I am getting 2 errors, uncaught.
Go ahead and share your screen. Let's take a quick look. Okay, seat is not defined. That is because I was sneaky
Oh,
and not only changed that console log seat, but also updated this variable right above it to be named seat instead.
gotcha.
And now we click on a seat, we get occupied true, and you are good to go.
Thank you.
I knew as soon as I changed that variable name, I was going to catch someone there. Anyone else need help? All right. Good news is we are done writing new code. The bad news is I need 15 more minutes of your attention to document everything that we just did tonight. We are going to pick
It's not bad news.
we are going to pick up where we left off, which is, I hope, number 16. Let me just make sure I don't have a 17 anywhere. No, I do not. So we are going to start at 17. So what was 16? We generate out all of these seats. We store them all up in this giant object up here. And then we need to make those seats show up. So nothing happens until 17. User changes the movie in the dropdown. Retrieve what movie they selected as a string, right? Then we use that string to get the corresponding movie data from the object in number 2. Number 2, all the way up here, this movie's data. Then we get lost in our own code and can't find 19. Okay. Then the console.logs I'm going to skip because hopefully you guys are getting the hang of, hey, in order to make sure that we're selecting this, we got to console log it out, make sure that we get what we're expecting. number 20, start an empty string that we can eventually add HTML to. 21, using object.entries, get access to the rows of seats from number 19 and also the index so we can keep track of what row num we are on. 22, add the opening div tag for our row to the string. 23, loop over all the columns in the row from number 21. So we're getting the seats out, we're looping over each one to get the row, then we're taking this row, looping over all of the rows to get out all of the columns. Then we are going to say generate a shitload of HTML using a template literal. Official measurement of code. So shitload. Okay, now that we're there, we need to add in a couple things, right? This not only generates the span tag with the chair as the contents, it also looks at the column we are looping over to see if it is occupied. If it is, we add, if it is occupied, using a ternary operator. What's a ternary operator? That's this inline if statement. We're going to use them a lot more once we get into React, but we say, if this thing is true, then do this thing, otherwise do this thing. Well, this thing happens to be an empty string, right? We're like, don't add anything if the seat isn't occupied. So if it is, we add the class name named occupied. We also use the row and col index that our favorite object.entries method gives us access to from number 21 and 23 to include as HTML attributes. So when the chair is clicked on, we can use that data to know each one. Finally, this order around because I didn't write my documentation in the right order. We add an on-click event. So when the chair is clicked on, we can fire an event listener. Then this 24, we should mention, runs 64 times. And we know that because if we, well, 64 times 4 for each one of no, it only runs 64 times because it's only running when we select a movie, right? And we know that all of this is working because we can look in our div ID seats and see all of the data that is getting generated out here. So we come all the way down to here and we say number 25. After we are done generating this these 8 seats, add the closing div tag to match number 22. We opened a div up here for the entire row. We now need to close that div down here. Now, 26, we are done generating all the seats. So add in the screen. And then finally, 27, take all the HTML that we have generated as a string and set it into the seats div. This is the step that JS stops treating our HTML as a string and actually makes the browser show it. Joe, it is usually best practice to remove your console logs. There are some build processes that will actually remove them automatically for you. There are some companies that enforce that you take them out before it goes to production code. So in general, you want to remove them. But there are also times that, like I work at a small enough company, we only have a small set of users. And so there are times that I will leave console logs in because I actually need them to debug with them, like on a screen share. So there's no like hard and fast rule about always taking them out. And in general, you want to leave them in but commented out if you think that it is something that will help you debug in the future, compared to if you're adding in those console logs just for development, then they shouldn't be commented out. They should be entirely removed. Okay. We do all of that work. Now, everything down here, you notice, is a higher number, right? Or a lower number? A lower number. Because all of that ran, we wrote all of that code in a different order. So the order that the computer runs this code is not necessarily the order that we write that code. And that happens. That is okay. So we put all of that HTML in. We come down here and go 28. Wait until a seat is clicked on. Retrieve the value. Hope if I remember to number, that's kind of the whole point of this, isn't it? Retrieve the value from the select, so we know what movie is active. Retrieve the row index and row call from all the way up here, number 24, based off what the event target was, i.e. what was clicked on. Use the data from 29 and 30 to access our main object from number 2 to get out the specific seat we care about. Row. What you talking about, Willis?
Number 30. Retrieve the row index and row call.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. I just want to make sure.
Totally right. All right. You now have 5 minutes to use all the brain power that you have left in your bodies to ask questions. We are not done with this project. We, believe it or not, have an entire day to go. We got to make the seat show up as blue, and then we have to handle edge cases and talk about counters as well. So the good news is tomorrow's class will be a little bit more hands-on in terms of actually having some challenges and working through them. It's not all, hey, just follow maps. So I'm going to get you started, and then I'm going to hand it off to you. You're going to have a chance to try it on your own, and then we will go over the solution together and move on to the next challenge from there. So we got 1 day left on this project. I actually don't know what we're going to do for Thursday's class yet. We may just roll right into the blog project, but I think we'll have a day or two at the end. I have not forgotten about the request for TypeScript, so that is a potential. But take the time, read over the comments. I'm going to push them up to GitHub right now. As a reminder, when you head over to Canvas, if you head to the modules and go down to the C6 My Code GitHub link, you will find that all of my code is in here. So you can go week 8, day 2, pop open script.js, and you'll see that everything numbered out is here, commented, all of that good stuff. So as a reminder that is all in here. But I will stick around for the next 3 minutes in case questions pop up. Otherwise, you guys can head out and have a great evening. Reminder that the 30-second feedback form exists, so if you want to fill that out, you totally can.
Do have a question.
Shoot.
So we did the data row index and call index to prepare to make the seats blue, right? Because we wanted to access them.
Yeah,
Okay.
so the row index and the call index, we haven't really done anything with. All we did is kind of proved out here that when you click on a seat, we get that specific seat from the movie data, right? So when we click on this one, you can see we get occupied true. That occupied true is what's trickling down from movies to the selected movies to the seats array from the row index and the call index. And we know that that's working because if we pick a seat that isn't occupied, we get occupied false. So yes, the goal is that we use those indexes to now get into, instead of just occupied true false, we're going to get into selected true or false.
Okay. And another question. Well,
Yeah.
I guess it's like a mix of a question slash comment. So, like I understand when you explain the functions and the text, but like I don't think I can generate this. Like, is that your expectation for so soon?
No. So expectation is by the end of the project, right? You could delete all of my comments, read through the line of code, not necessarily number them, that would be like extra credit, but you can at least read that line of code and be like, this is what it's doing, and this is why we did it.
Okay.
That's what
I
we
think I can
want to
do that.
shoot for at this point, right? Because we're going to progress, and you're only halfway through JavaScript. We're going to learn how to do this all in React, which is more practice with JavaScript. Then we're going to teach you how to do it in the back end, right? Which is whole new concept, but also still in JavaScript. And then we get to all the way to the end of that, and we go, now go do this in your capstone. Is your capstone a entire movie project with seat selection? No, of course not. But will someone have something where they go, hey, when I click on this thing, when I'm building a garden plot and I've got a grid and I need to keep track of where I have plants, you can go back to this code and reference that, right? We're going to do a login system so that you get examples there. We're going to do a blog. The blog is the next project, and we're going to have commenting there so that the user can interact, type in a comment, hit the save button, and have it show up. We're going to get into data storage so that all of those posts actually save onto the computer. Then, like a lot of these projects, we come back to them, right? And we go, hey, instead of just saving it on your computer, let's save it into a database so that everyone can access your blog posts, not just what you create on your computer. So we're going to keep on layering this in to the point where you go, I don't know how to do that. And then you're like, but wait a second, we did this in this other project. And you kind of start cobbling it together from there. And all of a sudden, it's a very rewarding moment when all of a sudden you're like, son of a, I do know how to write that code, right? Because how many times have you typed get element by ID? How many times have you done a for loop, right? You get to that point where you go, an array, I got to loop over that. And you're like, wait, how do I know that? Well, I've seen array so many times, and I know I need to get access to that individual data to do something with each individual thing in it. And that's where it starts to click and you start to build the confidence. So there's no like one moment where I'm like, that's it, you're never going to make it, you fail, get out of here, right? Like, but right now, no, I don't expect you to be able to make this project from scratch. All that you want to shoot for is saying, if I read that code, I can understand it. And then you start going through that numbered list and you start going, well, those steps make sense. So if I were to make something like this again, I know I'm confident with the on click. I'm confident with the function. I'm confident with the for loop. And all of a sudden you run out of concepts that you don't know how to use. And because of that, all of them kind of start puzzle piecing together better. It happens. I swear it happens.
Yeah, this looking like an all-nighter for me. I might have to pull an all-nighter for this one. Stay up until like 6 o'clock in the morning for this.
So the good news is the hardest part of this code is now over, right? That is the good news here. So tomorrow is a little bit easier. We give you a little bit more time to build confidence. We're going to give you tiny little tasks that only take a line or two of code to do. There is one day left. This is the hardest of all the JavaScript projects. So the other projects that we do are as many lines of code, but this is the boot camp moment where I'm screaming at you like a boot camp instructor, right? Because all the other projects are probably as equally complex, but this is the first time that you're exposed to all of these concepts all at once, right? From here on out, yeah, the other projects are just as hard, but because you have been exposed to these concepts, it isn't as hard, even though technically it is. Learning it, executing on it becomes easier because over time, you've already seen these things. It is past 8:30, so you are welcome to drop out. I have no life, so I will stick around for another 5 minutes before I go get my whiskey in case you have any questions. Otherwise, have an awesome evening.
I have a question not pertaining to queries and code.
Shoot.
So the class that I'm in now, we're doing Java.
I'm sorry.
And yeah, they recommended using Cloud Shell. There's also what is it? There's I've used Eclipse before years ago. I didn't really like it. I know I can use Visual Studio Code. Don't I just need to download the JDK
Yep.
extension, right?
Yep.
What is it under? I tried looking
I
for
am
it.
personally a JetBrains fan through and through. So they make is IntelliJ their Java one?
Yes, that's what it is. The
Yeah.
IDE for them. Yeah.
So I
That was
really
it. That was
like
the other one that they recommended.
I really like JetBrains. You can get a student license for free.
I have the EDU, that I can use for it.
Cool. So yeah, I really like them. Java is a naturally what we call a heavier language, right? In terms of it having a lot more built into it and needing a lot more to get it going compared to JavaScript, which like just runs in any browser anywhere, right? And so because it is a heavier language, I like using a heavier text editor for it, meaning it more of an IDE than a text editor. And because of that, IntelliJ will walk you through getting the JDK set up and making it easier to run your code. They'll make it easier to do breakpoint debugging, which is like a mid-level debugging tool for you to learn. When I say mid-level, I mean like not for beginners, but like kind of easy for experts. So I really like IntelliJ. I use WebStorm, which is JetBrains' version of IntelliJ for JavaScript. So I use that day in and day out at work instead of VS Code. But I think that especially for beginners, the IDE can be overwhelming. And so we don't use it in class, but I know a lot of students after graduation get into WebStorm and really like the breadth of all the tools that is included in it. So yeah, whatever works for you. If you like VS Code so far, like consider that. Otherwise, if you're looking for more of an IDE, I would recommend IntelliJ, especially because it is somewhat pricey of software, but because it's free for students, that makes it a lot more attractive.
And can you use it for other things, or is IntelliJ specifically for reading Java and Kotlin IDE?
It's specific for Java, but they also have WebStorm, which is specific for JavaScript, and PyCharm, which is specific for Python, and all of them are very similar. They're all based on the same. Sorry, someone shifted. I went, where did he go? They're all based off of the same like base software. So there are very a lot of similarities between them.
I gotcha. And what's the difference between Cloud Shell and IntelliJ? Is it literally just those like the IDE tools?
Cloud Shell, I believe. Cloud Shell is more about executing the code on a virtual machine in the cloud compared to the IDE, which is more about the text editor and running it locally.
Well, considering the day I had today trying to get Cloud Shell to work, maybe I should try to use IntelliJ then.
I am a big fan of doing software development locally as opposed to in the cloud. That's an opinion, not a fact or a statement, but just personal preference.
Well, I'm inclined to agree with that, so maybe I'll give IntelliJ a shot then.
Worth a go. Any other questions for tonight?
Yeah. So I don't know if you ever like felt like this before, but let's say you learn like, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, like like the syntax and stuff, but you feel like if you feel like you like in like tutorial hell, like how do you like get out of that? Because that's literally like I guess what's happening to me. It's like I understand these stuff, but when it comes to like actually like executing them, it's like my brain just we
Yeah,
forgot
so
everything. So
two things I can say for that. One is trust in the curriculum, right? Because one of the benefits of being enrolled in a real-time class is that like we're gonna cover this stuff and we're gonna keep on doing projects and you're gonna keep on getting more and more exposure to it. So don't go down rabbit holes too much of like, oh, I need another tutorial. Oh, I finished that tutorial. I still don't feel confident and I need another tutorial, right? Like it's very easy. There is an nearly endless amount of let me teach you HTML on the internet, and it is impossible to do them all, nor should you be doing them all, right? So one part of that is like give it time. We're only a third of the way into the program. We're on week 8 of 24. So we've got a lot more time to get you more practice, get you more exposure to it. That's my answer as a careers and code instructor. My answer as someone who is largely self-taught and taught himself JavaScript and Node and almost all of the languages that we're using now. Like I took AP Computer Science. I don't want to say that I'm completely self-taught. But what always got me through that, what ended up helping me pick the languages to figure out what to learn, what got me through not having a mentor or not being able to go to someone and say, here's what I think I should learn. Is that correct? was always a project, right? So in class, it's your capstone, but in general, you can say, why am I learning this? I'm learning this because I want to make this thing. And if you can make that thing, then the tutorials are helping. If you cannot make that thing, if you feel like you're not making progress, that's a bad tutorial and you may not be using the right one, or you may be learning the wrong thing. So set some kind of end objective out there to anchor onto and be like, this is for me. It was, I think it's really dumb that the dorms at SU were keeping track of packages by handwriting down the tracking numbers and putting slips of paper in people's mailboxes. I'm like, early 2010s. I'm like, we've got technology, everyone's got a smartphone in their pocket. Why in God's name are we still keeping track of packages that way? And that for me sounds like a really simple objective, but was like a year and a half of learning databases and back end and API building and Bootstrap and UIs and right. I can't tell you how many tutorials I went through. I was definitely in tutorial hell, but when I got to the end of one of those tutorials, I was able to say, now can I build the next step of this application, right? And then I got into authentication. It was like, oh, I got to learn about password encryption. And then I got into, well, I need a database to store all of that, right? Those are all things that our curriculum will cover, but in general, outside of careers in code, I would say have that end goal in mind, because there are also people who just love to learn and they're so proud. They're like, I'm a lifelong learner. And I'm like, yeah, but you're actually building shit with it, right? Like, are you just learning because you think learning is fun, or are you building something that's actually beneficial that people want to use? And that to me is much more important than the learning itself. So as much as I can say I'm a lifelong learner, as much as I can say I do frequently go out and learn new skills, I only learn those skills because there's a reason for me to learn them. There's something that I want to build. There is some end objective in mind, right? You don't become a woodworker and learn all about this stuff and then be like, yeah, I'm good. I'm now going to go learn about electricity. No, you become a woodworker and then you start building furniture or houses or whatever, right? Like, same goes for software development. You don't want to just learn it and go, well, that was fun, on to my next language. You want to be like, no, 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 I learned that language, so now I can build an API. So I can now build something interactive. So I can build an HTML web page. So I can do whatever. So that to me is the most important part of all of this, careers in code or not, is having that project that you can test your skills, even though in 5 years you're going to come back to it and be like, oh my God, I was such a bad developer. Doesn't matter, right? It's a means to an end to give you the confidence to say, no, no, I can actually build this. And in our curriculum, it happens to be the capstone, but I think it applies to everything.
And are we getting our mentors this week, or is it next week?
This week it should be.
Oh,
Famous
should
last
be.
words.
It's been a complicated process to figure out who to match you guys to, but I've reached a point where I'm like, it's got to get done.
That's
All
fair.
right. Any other questions?
No, that's it for me. You already answered all the questions I needed.
Cool. Well, have an awesome evening, guys, and I will talk to you later.
All right, you as
All right.
well.